Hello everyone, this is China Mosaic. I'm Vicky from the People's Daily. Joining us today is Professor Xie Tao from Beijing Foreign Studies University and his student Tang Ketian, a third-year undergraduate student majoring in English literature. Welcome.
Oh, very delighted to be here.
Let's talk about the stereotypes surrounding Generation Z first. Gen Z is a younger generation than the post-90s and refers to the people who was born on and after 1996. Some foreign media have used the phrase strong self-identity to describe China's Gen Z, with stories of generation born after 2000 rectifying the workplace. In those stories, they say no to unreasonable workplace practices, such as unpaid overtime, or taking too much duties, or saying no to the hustle culture. As a university professor, you are surrounded by Gen Z, right? Do you agree with this description of them, and what's your impression of them?
Absolutely. Among my students, like freshmen and sophomore students, many of them are born after 2000, so they belong to the Generation Z, as you call them. And I feel like, these students are somewhat different from the students that I taught like 10 years ago, or obviously very different from my generation. And I had a very strong sense that Generation Z have a very strong sense about their own identity. Identity could be defined in terms of their values, in terms of their pursuits and principles. So I feel like, they are more willing to stand up for their own values. And these values may not necessarily comport with our traditional or prevailing social norms. And so that's probably make them very different. As you say, in workplace, they are more willing to challenge some of these prevailing norms about, for example, you do overtime work without getting paid, and maybe your boss will call you after work. They are more willing to challenge the social norms that they perceive to be unfair. But they know the rules. For example, if you say you have to work overtime, and they say, why should I work overtime? Is this written in my contract? If it's not in my contract, why should I do this? So that's why I think, they have a strong sense of identity. They are more aware of their rights, and they care more about their privacy. So that's how I would characterize Generation Z as far as the ones that I teach and the ones that I interact with on a daily basis.
Good to know. So what about you, Ketian? I believe that you are a member of Gen Z, so what do you think?
So first, I think I totally agree with my Professor Xie has said, and I think fight against what they think is unfair treatment in workplace is definitely understandable. And second is that I think the feeling of those people when they face such unfair treatment, I think the reluctance or the feeling of unfairness is the same between generations. But the difference as a Gen Z, I think, is about whether they're willing to express such kind of reluctance and whether they have this kind of consciousness of right to actually stand up and fight against. And that is why I think it actually reflects the spirit of revolution or the courage to stand up against what they think is unfair.
It sounds like a healthy self-awareness, right?
Yeah, I think it's definitely healthy. And I think why they actually gather this kind of courage is maybe because of the popularity of social media. And that is why they get a platform to share each other's thoughts and get backup in social media.
So, Professor, what terms would you use to describe Gen Z in the academic environment in the Chinese universities?
Let me think. I would use the term that is used to describe Asian Americans in the United States, a term that is called overachieving or overachiever. The kind of a label is used to describe people who are very ambitious, people who are deeply motivated, and so they always want to be the best in the class or in their cohort. And so that kind of an internal drive to be excellent in almost everything that you do. So I would use that word overachieving. So take Beihai, the university where I'm based, as an example. So every student seems to be working, overtime, working like 10 hours or 15 hours a day. And everybody wants to be the best in terms of ranking, in terms of GRE score or TOEFL score, in terms of national scholarship application. Being the best is a good thing. But I think, one downside of being an overachiever is that you could lose many other things. For example, you have less time to enjoy yourself. Like, when people are partying and you are spending your weekend in the library, right? So I would offer a piece of advice to overachieving Chinese students is that for undergraduate education, the central purpose is general education. General means you should broaden your horizon. You should know more about a large number of topics instead of focusing very narrowly on a tiny field. That's my piece of advice to Generation Z.
So, Professor, how do they differ from the people who was born from 1990 to 1995, which we called the post-90s generation in China?
My perception is that the post-1990s generation, they studied and they became adults in the best years of China's economic development. So the early 21st century was really the prime time of China's economy. So I think they probably felt a stronger sense of economic security. Whereas the post-2000 generation, the Generation Z, because of pandemic, because of the global financial crisis, and so they have a stronger sense of financial insecurity. So that perhaps leads to this so-called involution. They are becoming even more overachieving in order to make up for whatever they believe that is missing in their abilities. So in other words, the Generation Z, they feel more pressure. And so they are even more motivated to try their best. That's my perception of the difference between the two generations.
Right. So you mentioned the pandemic. Let's talk about this. It's already been 3 years since the outbreak of the COVID-19. Our lives have changed dramatically. So as a professor at BFSU, you have witnessed the changes on campus. What do you think is the biggest impact of the pandemic on college students in China?
Looking back, it's kind of like a nightmare to almost everybody. For university education, online teaching and learning is very different from in-person learning and teaching. I also taught a lot of courses online. When you turn on the camera, but the students didn't turn on the camera, so you don't know really what they are doing. Probably they were just eating, they were maybe just doing some shopping, or maybe they were sleeping, right? So there's no way you can monitor students' progress and their attention. So that's one big problem. The second problem is in terms of assessment, that is exams. Well, if you have in-person exam, it's much easier for you to just walk around the classroom, and so make sure that nobody's cheating, right? But when you take online exam, that causes a lot of logistic issues, like you have to use a lot of cameras.
So what about you, Ketian? I saw some weird smile on your face since the professor mentioned the online courses.
Considering about online education, I think what is fortunate is that during the pandemic, we have another method to continue our study, to continue our ordinary life. And I do have to agree that online education makes a lot of things much cheaper and much accessible for a lot of people. But I do agree with Professor Xie that online teaching absolutely distract students, even like me, distract us from give our 100% attention in the class. And actually online teaching offered us less motivation to actively engage with professors or with our classmates. And secondly is that I think what we actually trying to pursue in education is not really only about the content that can be recorded, that can be repeated in online education. What we actually pursue is also about like socializing with our classmates, knowing our professors, and like be in person and do actual interact with each other. And that is why I think offline education or offline interaction cannot be replaced.
It's all about connection.
Yeah.
So, have you had any changes in your attitude toward your college studies or your life?
Because of the online
The pandemic.
Yeah, I think because of the pandemic, my generation feel anxious because they feel like maybe because of the online education, because of maybe the not that bright future of their employment or the evolution, like what the professor Xie just mentioned, I think most of us feel anxious about whether we can actually achieve a bright future when we graduate.
Yeah, so that's maybe the reason why Professor Xie mentioned that you guys are so overachieving since you guys feel so insecure during these 2 years, right?
Yeah.
So how are things going on now?
I think the trend of becoming an overachiever is still like ongoing right now. And I do understand why people have the anxiety of becoming an overachiever because they feel insecure, because like Professor Shi just mentioned, they lack this kind of security coming from economic affluence, etc. And I think this is definitely not a good trend because when everyone wants to become the best, that means the majority of them will be disappointed because only several people can become the best. I think this is not beneficial both to the students' mental health, to their physical health, and to how they actually perceive themselves and to actually discover what actually suit them the best. Like Professor Xie just mentioned, like when you focus only on a certain narrow field, you choose to neglect the like more general education and more fields that you possibly like potentially can explore. And that is how I think many students and many of my friends are immersed in this kind of anxiety and lose this kind of ability to really understand themselves and to explore what they potentially can explore.
That's kind of pathetic. As we all know, summer is a graduation season, and that's a time for college students to have a chance to get on in life. What's your plan, Ketian?
So as for my plan, I don't have a really like a fixed plan that I have to achieve, but I do want to continue to have postgraduate study in China. And if I unfortunately cannot, I don't think I will like be so disappointed, and I think I will lay my hope on finding a job right after graduation.
So, have you ever thought to finding a job that is not related to your major?
Yeah, I think for me, like finding a job that is perfectly suitable for English major is not that easy. I think my interest and my like the fields that I want to explore is much more than just the language or translation, etc. So I have considered about working in game industry or working in debate education industry, etc.
So, why game industry is quite different from your major, right?
Yeah, that is true. I think why I consider game industry is first, I think working is hard. Yeah.
Game is fine.
Yeah, working is hard, life is hard. If you try to earn money, especially in mega cities, it's going to be hard. And evolution is prevailing, and I don't think I can survive it. Then I think it's definitely going to be happier if I work hard in a field that I like instead of a field that I don't like. Or so that is why in all those fields, I prefer game industry.
So there is a question for you guys too, but I will go to Professor Xie first. There is a phrase that has gone viral on the internet recently. 人生是旷野，不是轨道. Life is wilderness, not a track. So some people take a gap year when they are confused about their future, but others stay on the traditional path, even though they are confused too. What's your take on that, Professor Xie?
I agree with this that if life is a track, that means it's path dependence. That means you don't have choice. It's already preset because tracks means that you have to follow, you have to travel on this, right? Whereas if it's a wilderness, if it's a universe, That means you have the freedom to choose, to make your own choices. And why you should follow the path set by your parents, by your peers, or by your bosses. So I think this is one thing that really distinguishes Generation Z from the prior generations. They are more aware of their self-interest, and they are more aware of their hobbies, and they are willing to pursue their own interest, and they are willing to pursue their hobbies. Okay. In terms of like taking a year off, that is gap year, I noticed that there are increasing number of Chinese students who are taking gap year, more than it used to be. But still, compared with, let's say, Western college students, our number is still very, very small. Because in China, there's kind of a stigma attached to any student who say, I'll just graduate 1 year later, because people think that you are just somehow you did something bad. You get punished.
They
And so-
prefer to graduate 1 year earlier.
Right. Many parents would want their children to graduate 3 years out of college or 4 years out of PhD. And so that kind of a stigma attached to gap year should really be eliminated. So I would sometimes encourage my students, if they are really like a loss about what they want to do and what are their true interests, I said, why don't you just take 1 year off? Do something, internship, travel around the world, travel around China, and do some volunteer work. And maybe during this process, you will find your true interest. You will find your true identity. But once you know your identity, you know the direction. And then you would have the motivation and the drive to pursue what you want to do.
So what about you, Ketian? Will you take a gap year if you are confused about your study or life?
I would say I'm willing to do so, but in a more realistic aspect, I think a gap year as an option is not that acceptable in Chinese environment, because most of the companies, most of the employers assume that a gap year indicates your incapability, indicates you're at loss, indicate that you're not that determined, or etc., etc. And that is why I think gap year is still not a widely accepted option for Chinese students. But for my own opinion, I would like to take a gap year, because I do think that have the time to explore and have the time to understand more about yourself, understand more about what exactly you actually want, is more important than becoming a so-called life winner that our families or the elder generation or the society expect you to be.
So there is an option for undergraduate students in the United States to choose a major in the first year called undefined major. Do you think it's a good option for them?
I was at Northwestern University for 4 years. So I think their rule is that for the first 2 years, you don't have to have a major. So the first 2 years is called general education. You choose a foreign language, you study history, you study literature. And then starting from your junior year, that is a third year, you declare a major and a minor. And so for major, you have to take like 5 courses, and for minor, you have to take 3 or 4 courses. That's all about your undergraduate degree. So there is no requirement for an undergraduate thesis unless you want to pursue, say, an honors program. Okay. So I think, their education, we're trying to kind of emulate their model, like at Tsinghua and Peking and Fudan. They also have this general education college, like Yuanpei College. Like Fudan, they also have a college. So I think, we are emulating some of the good models of education. But unfortunately, I have to say, for foreign language major students in China, they rarely have the luxury, because learning a foreign language, as Ketian knows, really requires enormous amount of time investment, especially if you want to be the best in your class.
Right, you need to practice a lot during the 4 years, right? Yeah. Last question, kind of serious. As a scholar who studies China-US relations, the relaxation of travel restrictions and the resumption of cross-border tourism have also facilitated culture exchanges between China and the US. What are your expectations that the cultural exchanges between Chinese and American youth in the rest of 2023?
To be honest, I was very pessimistic about resuming or restarting US-China people-to-people exchanges, especially after my January 3-week visit to the United States. That was also my first visit to the United States since 2016. And so you can't believe this. I studied in the United States. But the last time I was in the United States was before Donald Trump was elected. So it was 6 years, right? So I get a very strong feeling during my 3-week stay there is that, very few American students or scholars were willing to travel over to China. I sent out many invitations to my friends, students whom I know, but they seem very uninterested. So that's why I came back and I wrote an opinion piece published in the Global Times, and I characterized the current stage of US-China cultural exchanges as entering a cold winter, and a long cold winter. But that was my sense about 3 months ago. I would say today I'm becoming a little bit more optimistic, especially after the most recent visit by U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and his meeting with his Chinese counterpart, and plus the remarks by President Xi Jinping during his meeting with Blinken. So I think there is a sign that people-to-people exchanges like college students and high school students and summer schools are going to pick up, especially in the coming summer. I hope that we are going to see more U.S. students and scholars coming over to China. I know that there's solid numbers that today there's only like less than 300 U.S. students in China. And then you have to think about how many Chinese students are in the United States, over 300,000. So this is a totally asymmetric, and this is totally lopsided. So we do need to get more U.S. scholars, students, high school students coming over to China, seeing China with their own eyes, and then they understand the true China. Don't be misled by some of these U.S. politicians and their distortions and misinformation about China. The best way to do that is get them over to China and let them see with their own eyes.
That's right. So hopefully we will see something exciting and inspiring happen soon. Thank you so much for coming to our show today. This is China Mosaic. I'm Vicky. See you next time.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.